Hey, everybody. It's time for us to start digging into consumer preferences, which we're going to do in three parts. First, we're going to talk about the assumptions that we make about preferences in economics. In particular, we make three basic assumptions about preferences in econ. The first is called completeness. And we assume that consumers can and do rank all possible baskets of goods. By baskets of goods here, I just mean any possible collection of goods. So it could be one good versus another. It could be two grocery carts of goods. Regardless of the two collections of goods, consumers can and do rank the two of them. A slightly more formal way of saying this is that for any two baskets of goods, A and B, a consumer prefers A to B, prefers B to A, or feels indifferent between A and B. In other words, consumers know exactly how they feel about baskets. There is no, I don't know how I feel about two baskets of goods in our model. One thing to note about these preferences is that they don't depend on cost. So, for example, I might prefer steak to hamburger, but that doesn't mean I'm always going to buy steak over hamburger, right? Because hamburger is a lot cheaper than steak. It just says that my preference, irrespective of price, is for steak over hamburger. Great. Our second assumption is called transitivity. Transitivity is the assumption that if a consumer prefers basket A to basket B and basket B to basket C, then the consumer also prefers basket A to basket C. So for example, let's say you prefer taking a cab to taking the subway, and you prefer taking the subway to taking the bus. Then in econ, we assume that you also prefer taking a cab to taking the bus. This assumption is important to our idea of consumer rationality in the model. It's important to our for getting a model in which consumers act consistently. Our third and final assumption, which is actually the least important assumption, is called non-satiation. The non-satiation assumption is the idea that more of a good is better than less of a good. In other words, goods are desirable. This is clearly a flawed assumption, right? There are certainly bads out there in the world. There are certainly things that are undesirable, so it makes sense to label them as bads rather than goods. Air pollution might be an example. We don't want more air pollution. I can't think of anyone who wants more air pollution. For now, we're going to leave those out of our model. It's actually pretty easy to incorporate them into the model, but for pedagogical reasons, we're going to leave them out because when we start to think about preferences graphically, our graphs are going to be a lot cleaner if we assume that more of a good is better than less of a good. Another caveat on this assumption, or another thing to note, is that we are not saying that every additional unit of a good confers the same amount of benefit. We're just saying that every additional unit confers some positive benefit. So for example, let's say you go to Krispy Kreme before school and you buy a box of a dozen donuts for breakfast. That first donut you eat is going to be glorious. It's going to be delicious. You're hungry, having not eaten since dinner. It's going to be so satisfying. Once you've already eaten 11 other donuts, that 12th and final donut is probably going to contribute much less to your life satisfaction than that first glorious donut did. That 12th donut, you're pretty much already full. You've already got your sugar high. You're basically just trying to get rid of the box at that point. So it's not conferring nearly the same amount of benefit, but there is like some small, tiny benefit from having that 12th donut. Clearly, all three of these assumptions are flawed. That's totally fine. That's why this is a model of how consumers behave, and it's not some fundamental truth. It's important to keep in mind that everything we're building here is flawed somehow. And most of the flaws of what we're going to build on consumer theory stem from these three assumptions. Like I mentioned in the last video, there's a whole branch of economics dedicated to chipping away at these assumptions and making them more realistic. But to start out, we're going to start simple, and we're still going to build a very powerful model that has some real insight into the world and how people behave. But let's go in eyes wide open, knowing that this is an imperfect model. Great. I'll see y'all in the next video.